Welcome to No Man's Memory, where wars become stories. For most people, the American Revolution is remembered as a devastating defeat for the British Empire. 13 colonies broke away, Britain lost a costly war, and a new republic appeared on the world stage. In popular memory, this feels like the kind of humiliation that should have demanded revenge. A global superpower losing territory across the Atlantic should have reacted with panic and immediate plans for reconquest. But inside London, the reaction was far quieter than most people imagine. There was no massive emergency mobilization to retake America. No giant invasion fleet prepared to cross the ocean again. No urgent plan emerged to reclaim the colonies by force. For historians, this creates an uncomfortable question. Why would the most powerful empire on Earth simply wait? For King George III, the loss was painful, but not catastrophic. Britain still controlled the strongest navy in the world, protected major trade routes, and ruled territories far more profitable than the former colonies. India and Caribbean trade mattered more to Britain's future than North America ever had. Economically, the separation proved less damaging than expected. British merchants still dominated Atlantic commerce. Tobacco from Virginia, grain from New York, and cotton from the southern states still moved through British financial networks and shipping routes. This created a strange paradox for the British Empire. Britain no longer had to spend money governing the colonies, defending frontier settlements, or managing endless political disputes between colonial governments. Yet British businesses still earned enormous profits from American trade. From London's perspective, territory had been lost, but economic access remained. Even more important was the political condition of the new United States. Under the Articles of Confederation, the federal government looked weak and unstable. Congress struggled to collect taxes, regulate trade, or enforce decisions between the states. To many British observers, America did not appear to be a future rival. It looked like a fragile political experiment barely holding itself together. British leaders such as William Pitt the Younger viewed the situation practically rather than emotionally. The real question was not whether Britain had technically lost the war. That was already settled. The question was whether another war was even necessary. Why rush into another expensive conflict to reclaim a land that still traded with Britain, still followed British customs, and still depended on British finance? From London's perspective, American independence did not necessarily look permanent. It looked temporary. Britain believed time might solve the problem without military force. Many British politicians saw monarchy as the natural structure for governing large societies. Republics without hereditary elites were rare in history and often collapsed under internal pressure. From that perspective, the United States seemed less like a stable nation and more like an uncertain experiment. Early American politics appeared to confirm those fears. States argued constantly over debt, taxes, borders, and national authority. Newspapers reported instability and division rather than unity. To observers in London, these were not normal growing pains. They were warning signs that the system might eventually fail. There was also a cultural calculation behind British patience. Americans still spoke English, followed English legal traditions, traded primarily with British merchants, and used institutions shaped by British political culture. Churches, courts, and commercial systems still reflected British influence. The break seemed political rather than civilizational. And political breaks, Britain believed, could eventually be reversed. This created a quiet expectation inside Britain's leadership. If Republican government failed to provide order or prosperity, Americans might eventually search for alternatives. And without an American monarchy or aristocracy, any search for legitimacy could potentially point back toward Britain itself. British history reinforced this thinking. The memory of England's own Republican period during the 17th century remained important in political culture. That republic had been unstable and eventually collapsed, restoring the monarchy afterward. To many British leaders, revolutions did not always move forward permanently. Sometimes history reversed itself. Under these assumptions, patience made strategic sense. Reconquering America would require enormous money, soldiers, ships, and political risk. If the United States might collapse internally over time, then waiting seemed smarter than fighting. Britain saw no reason to rush into another massive Atlantic war while America still looked politically uncertain. From London's perspective, the real question was not whether the United States had broken away successfully. The real question was whether it could survive long enough to remain independent. Britain's belief that the American experiment might eventually fail was strengthened by how incomplete the separation still looked in practice. Independence transferred political sovereignty, but many of the deeper connections between the two societies remained untouched. British law still shaped American courts and property systems. British banks financed American trade. British ships continued appearing constantly in American ports. Tobacco, grain, and cotton still crossed the Atlantic through commercial networks connected to London. From Britain's perspective, America did not fully resemble a foreign civilization. It looked more like a familiar system operating under different management. This continuity mattered because it suggested reversibility. A country still dependent on British trade, British finance, and British legal traditions did not appear permanently detached. At the same time, the weakness of the American federal government remained obvious. Under the Articles of Confederation, Congress could request money but could not force states to provide it. Treaties were difficult to enforce, and states often followed completely different policies. To British observers, this did not look like a future superpower. It looked like a state struggling to function. The adoption of the United States Constitution changed part of this picture, but not completely. A stronger federal government promised greater stability, yet the fact that America already needed to rewrite its political system seemed like proof that the original structure had failed. To many British observers, reform confirmed weakness rather than removing doubts. The United States appeared to be correcting itself, but nobody knew whether the correction would last. Before Britain could fully reconsider America, events in Europe completely transformed British priorities. The French Revolution exploded across the continent, creating fears of chaos, war, and political collapse throughout Europe. For William Pitt the Younger, this crisis became far more urgent than the uncertain future of the United States. A hostile power dominating Europe threatened Britain directly. Revolutionary France could disrupt the balance of power, challenge British naval supremacy, and threaten Britain's security much more seriously than America ever could. As a result, British resources shifted toward Europe. Fleets, armies, and financial support were redirected into wars against France. Britain's attention narrowed out of necessity rather than choice. In this environment, the United States became a secondary concern. Even when tensions between Britain and America increased, Britain still avoided treating the United States as its primary enemy. Most conflicts developed at sea rather than on land. Britain desperately needed sailors to maintain naval blockades against France, and manpower shortages became severe during the Napoleonic Wars. This led to impressment, where British naval forces stopped ships and seized sailors suspected of being British subjects. Americans viewed this as a violation of sovereignty and national honor. From London's perspective, however, the policy was driven by survival rather than hatred toward the United States. British leaders believed maintaining naval superiority against France mattered more than avoiding diplomatic tensions with America. Britain accepted American anger because weakening the Royal Navy seemed far more dangerous. These pressures eventually helped trigger the War of 1812. But even this war was not designed as a grand attempt to reconquer the United States. By 1812, Britain was still locked in a life-or-death struggle against Napoleon Bonaparte. Every military decision was measured against the needs of the European war. Troops, ships, and supplies were limited. North America received only what Britain could spare. This reality shaped British strategy during the War of 1812 from the very beginning. Britain's main objective was not conquering the United States. The priority was defending Canada. Canada was lightly populated, vulnerable, and difficult to reinforce across the Atlantic Ocean. Losing it would damage Britain's imperial credibility and weaken its position in North America. When British forces launched offensive operations, they were usually limited and strategic. Coastal raids disrupted American commerce and forced the United States to divide resources internally. The burning of Washington demonstrated British reach and military capability, but it was never intended to begin a permanent occupation. Holding major American cities would require enormous manpower and long-term commitments Britain simply could not afford. Leaders in London understood this clearly. Prime Minister Lord Liverpool approached the war cautiously. He knew battlefield victories were one thing, but governing conquered American territory would be completely different and far more expensive. Britain's goal was leverage, not restoration of the old empire. Military pressure was meant to push America toward negotiation and reduce interference with Britain's naval war against France. The war was about protecting Britain's global position, not reversing the American Revolution. Britain's true intentions during the War of 1812 became clearest not on the battlefield, but in territorial planning. Instead of trying to destroy the United States, British leaders focused mainly on defensive adjustments near Canada. One of the most serious ideas involved Eastern Maine. During the war, British forces occupied parts of the region and used them to secure supply routes connecting the Atlantic Ocean with Canada. The proposed colony, often called New Ireland, was designed as a defensive buffer rather than the beginning of a massive reconquest campaign. This distinction mattered. Maine was sparsely populated, strategically useful, and already under British military control. If Britain demanded any territory at all during peace negotiations, this was considered the safest and most realistic option. But even these limited ambitions carried risks. As the war continued, Britain feared wasting resources in North America while Europe approached a decisive stage in the struggle against Napoleon. Every additional demand could strengthen American resistance and prolong the conflict unnecessarily. Eventually, Britain made a deliberate decision. When peace negotiations finally opened, British diplomats chose not to demand permanent territorial concessions from the United States. Despite holding occupied territory and possessing military leverage, Britain agreed to restore pre-war borders. Occupations on both sides would end, and boundaries would remain unchanged. This decision was not caused by military collapse or defeat. It reflected larger strategic priorities beyond North America. Britain wanted stability more than expansion. British leaders believed continuing rivalry with the United States no longer justified the cost, especially while Europe still required attention. By refusing even limited territorial gains, Britain effectively signaled that North America no longer mattered enough to justify endless conflict. The War of 1812 therefore clarified Britain's position. Britain still possessed the power to strike the United States, raid cities, and project force across the Atlantic. But the war also revealed the limits of what Britain was willing to risk. Power still existed, but it was being rationed carefully. The empire increasingly focused on preserving global dominance rather than reclaiming former colonies. As the War of 1812 ended, Britain faced an even larger challenge: rebuilding Europe after more than 20 years of continuous warfare. Victory over Napoleon did not automatically guarantee peace. Britain needed to help create a stable balance of power across Europe to prevent another continental disaster. This responsibility heavily influenced British foreign policy after 1815. Leaders such as Lord Castlereagh focused on diplomacy, alliances, and long-term European stability rather than territorial expansion in North America. Britain needed allies to trust British intentions, not fear endless imperial ambition. Pressuring the United States for land would risk damaging that delicate diplomatic environment. Compared to Europe, American territory offered very little strategic value. Britain calculated that maintaining peace with the United States would produce greater long-term benefits than trying to force concessions. There was also another important realization. A humiliated America forced to surrender territory could become a permanent enemy. A stable America allowed to leave the war intact might instead become a profitable trading partner and a manageable regional power. Britain increasingly preferred trade and stability over expensive attempts at domination. After 1815, British strategy changed even further. The empire's center of gravity shifted toward Asia, especially India. India offered revenue, manpower, trade opportunities, and strategic depth on a scale North America simply could not match. British administrators, soldiers, and investment increasingly flowed eastward. At the same time, Britain expanded influence across Africa and protected critical maritime choke points around the world. The empire focused less on reclaiming old settler colonies and more on controlling trade routes, ports, and strategic regions. This model of empire fit Britain's strengths far better. Instead of wasting resources governing large rebellious populations, Britain concentrated on naval supremacy, finance, and selective territorial control. Another major concern also emerged: Russia. Russian expansion towards Central Asia threatened British interests connected to India. This rivalry required enormous diplomatic and military attention for decades. Compared to those challenges, the United States no longer represented an urgent strategic problem. In fact, peace with America became economically useful. Trade expanded steadily, benefiting British industry without the cost of administration or military occupation. For Britain, stability delivered profits that reconquest never realistically promised. By the middle of the 19th century, the balance between Britain and the United States had changed completely. The United States expanded westward, industrialized rapidly, and built institutions capable of mobilizing huge amounts of money, manpower, and production. What once looked fragile and temporary now appeared stable and increasingly powerful. For Britain, this transformation changed the meaning of risk. Retaking American territory was no longer something that could be achieved through a limited military expedition or political pressure campaign. Any serious attempt at reconquest would require a massive long-term war against a country capable of fighting for years. Distance also worked against Britain. Supplying armies across the Atlantic was expensive and difficult. America's growing population and industrial economy made quick victory increasingly unrealistic. The most immediate problem was Canada. Canada was not a perfect launching point for reconquest. It was vulnerable. Any major war with the United States would expose Canada to invasion and possible destruction. Defending Canada was realistic. Gambling it in an attempt to rebuild the old empire was not. By this point, the assumptions Britain once held after the American Revolution had completely collapsed. The American Republic had not fallen apart under internal divisions. It had not returned to monarchy. It had not requested reintegration into the British Empire. Instead, time had produced the exact opposite outcome Britain originally expected. Ironically, the same patience Britain once believed would weaken America eventually allowed the United States to become stronger, richer, and more stable. There was never a dramatic moment when Britain officially abandoned the dream of retaking the United States. No famous declaration ended the possibility forever. No single government announced a final decision. The idea simply became irrelevant over time. What once seemed unnecessary eventually became impossible. Britain did not fail to reconquer America because it lacked military strength at one decisive moment. The empire still possessed enormous global power throughout the 19th century. The real reason Britain never tried seriously again was because every strategic calculation pointed elsewhere. British leaders consistently prioritized Europe, global trade, naval dominance, India, and imperial stability over revenge in North America. At every stage, reclaiming the United States appeared too expensive, too risky, or simply unnecessary compared to other global priorities. By the time America became powerful enough that Britain might truly need to worry about it, the opportunity for reconquest had already disappeared forever. History had quietly closed the door. Britain adapted instead of obsessing over lost colonies. The empire concentrated power where it could produce the greatest strategic return. Trade networks, naval control, finance, and overseas influence mattered far more than restoring old borders. In many ways, Britain's restraint after the American Revolution revealed something important about how empires survive. Great powers do not always chase revenge. Sometimes they calculate costs, shift priorities, and move toward more valuable opportunities elsewhere. The British Empire did not ignore America because it was weak. It ignored America because, for most of the 19th century, British leaders believed the future of global power would be decided somewhere else entirely. And by the time that assumption changed, the United States had already become too strong to take back.